Okay, so it is now 2 o'clock, so I think it's time to start. Welcome everybody to our today's webinar with a topic on what makes a great year. Um, as usual, as before in the webinars, I will be doing the presentation, which will last approximately 30 to 45 minutes. And during the webinar, if you have questions, please use the chat box. So I'll try to keep an eye on that and answer your questions in the meanwhile. Or otherwise, after the presentation, we will open the discussion for all of you. You can make your comments and also ask your questions then if that's more pleasurable way for you to ask the questions. How the webinar will be going ahead today is that we'll first go through the yearly cycle of a vine, just to remind us all about what happens during the year that might actually be meaningful in terms of the topic today. So how does the yearly events infect and affect the successful growth? And then we will go through each of the 4 wines that we've are tasting today, and we'll be discussing the vintages the wines are made at and the conditions and so forth. But what I really try to stress throughout this webinar is that it is increasingly difficult to make generalizations on vintages. And if you only just read a weather report, it is very, very difficult to really make an adjustment about what the vintage has been like. So as assessment about the vintage. So it's really, if you just look at the weather report, it's just one side when you're looking at one viewpoint to look at the year. So hopefully after this seminar, you'll understand how complicated this subject actually is. Okay, so let's start. When we talk about the yearly cycle, actually the vine's yearly cycle already happens, or the vintage's successfulness already happens in the previous vintage. So after harvest, the photosynthesis still carries on, and it builds carbohydrates inside the vine. And all these carbohydrates are built until the vine goes into its winter dormancy. And as much as if there's more carbohydrates built up in the vine, it will help next season with the fruitfulness. So the roots and the shoots and the flower clusters will benefit from these carbohydrates. Obviously, this happens much more in the warmer climates than in the cooler climates. As in the cooler climates, the winter tends to come quite soon after the harvest. So that also means that the cooler climates tend to have lower yields than the warm climates. But the first thing that happens after the winter dormancy is the bud burst. And bud burst usually happens when the temperatures rise above 10 degrees Celsius. And earlier the bud burst happens, then it's kind of the better, because then the ripening period will occur during the warmer conditions of the summer. But there's 2 risks in this. First is obviously the spring frost risk. So if the buds have been bursting and then the frost comes, the buds might freeze. And also nowadays, as summers are getting hotter and hotter, and the ripening happens during the summer, we kind of want it to happen during the summer, because the autumn weather is always very difficult. So you might have rains coming, storms coming, so forth. But now, as the summers are getting hotter and hotter, it means that the ripening happens perhaps too fast as well. So this is a kind of double-edged sword. But these dormant buds, they are actually already developed the year before. So also the amount of sunshine that those buds get during the previous year, that's a huge impact on the fruitfulness of the buds. So all these buds, if they get a lot of sunshine, they are likely to become flowers, but otherwise buds will also become leaves. And in this picture, you can see that most of them have become flowers. So when we get into flowering, we wish that the flowering is early and rapid. If it's quick, then the yield will be much more homogeneous, so uniform. and we won't have that much problems. And also when it happens in good conditions, a lot more flowering happens, and then also obviously the yields will be better. But also the floral initiation already happens the previous year. It's usually actually already 18 months before, so before harvest. So going back, it happens if we were thinking of flowering this year, then we would already, flowering this year, harvest this year, we go 18 months back. So that would mean the flowering last year, that's when the floral initiation happens, and that temperature and those sunshine hours already matter and make a huge difference for the next year. So it's already that time when the maximum potential that we would harvest this year is already determined last year's flowering. And here we have heat and light and plant photosynthesis that's crucial. So the optimum temperature for flowering is around, if we really would want to have a bigger flowering, would be 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. But it's very, very rarely, as you know, achieved in cool climates. Rain during flowering can be really detrimental because it's inhibiting pollination and fertilization of the flowers. And also, if the flower caps are shed off, there won't be any fruit. So we don't want flowering to be happening in cool and wet conditions. So warmth and sunny weather is the ideal. So between flowering and then the fertilization, as in the fruit set, the period is usually 2 weeks. And successful fruit sets, so the fertilized flowers turning into berries, that's also a point when we can look at the yield, and which will affect the yield. So problems with fruit set are, for example, coulure, which is poor fruit set, freely translated, and then millerandage, which is when you have a lot of seedless grapes in the bunch. There are producers who actually like millerandage, and for example, in Margaret River in the Western Australia, they often use a Chardonnay clone called Gingin, which is very known to have millerandage problems, because then the bunches have less grapes and the grapes become much more concentrated. So they actually get better wine out of it as well. I'm just going to hide the camera. There we go. So the typical success rate at fruit set is actually only 45%. It would be huge if it was 50% success rate, but it's quite low already at 30%. So it's by no means all the flowers will be fertilized to become berries. Water stress at this point of the vine's age, it can be very detrimental, because the water from the soils is replenishing the vine and helping it to start growing those grapes. So what we really look into and want to have is the soils being full of water after the winter. So in many areas where vines are grown, like Mediterranean climates, most rainfall does happen during the winter time, and that's really essential for the growth next spring. And if we get into if we get into what happens between then fruit set and veraison, it's the root that's growing then as well, not just the grapes. So the roots also need all of this water to be able to grow, to go deeper in the ground, and all of this development happens between flowering and veraison. So if you look at the whole cycle, starting from the spring to the autumn, in the northern hemisphere, the plant is focusing on flowers, then it's focusing on the roots, and then it's focusing on the fruit. So that's the order that the plant goes through the cycle. So then we get into veraison. So veraison is when glucose and fructose start to develop, and malic acid starts to become metabolized. So this is when the sugar starts to accumulate. So until this, it's been mainly about green growth. The grapes have been growing bigger, but now they actually start tasting of something. So also these aroma and flavor compounds and precursors are starting to be developed. So all the focus goes now into this. At this point, just before, during, and slightly after vegetaison, a slight water stress is actually a good thing, because that stimulates the enzymes that are responsible for creating these aroma and flavor compounds, and also tannins, if we talk about red grapes. So slight water stress at this point is fine. But then after vegetaison, if we have like really warm summers like we've had on a couple of years lately, the berries might start to get dehydrated too soon, and the sugar accumulation might stop, because the plant realizes that I'm not having enough water for my food production, and I need the water to survive as a plant, and then it stops all of this fruitful production. So water stress is fine at vegetaison, but not so much between vegetaison and harvest time. And also the white varieties tend to be much more the water stress is much more difficult for white varieties, as often the white grapes lose their aromatics during water stress, whereas red grapes might actually benefit from that. Okay, so then we get into the maturation of the grapes, and we can talk about sugar accumulation and sugar ripening, but we can also talk about the phenological ripening. So we take in consideration not just the sugar, but also the color and the thickness of the skin, the maturation of the tannins, the seeds, the stems, flavor, all of those things. So it's not just about the sugar, as you know. And we start seeing the lignification of seeds and stems as well, where they start to get browner and browner. And depending when we want to harvest the grapes, we can't just look at one of these parameters, because if we just look at the sugars, we might have high sugars, but then actually the grapes will taste raw. So these are also issues that need to be taken into consideration. And then we get into the harvest time. So during harvest time, the most crucial thing is to have good weather. If you have rainfall during the harvest, you have a lot of fungal diseases, disease pressure. You might have diluted grapes because they are sucking in all the water from the soil. So also in some areas you might get even earlier in the year, but you also might get at harvest time hails, thunderstorms. So it's very difficult. And this is also pointing to the previous slide and the ripeness of the grapes. A lot of producers who buy grapes from growers, they price the grapes according to the weight. And this can be kind of problematic, because then growers will only look at the sugar, as grapes with higher sugar content obviously are more heavier than grapes that might be ripe but not so full of sugar. So also it depends how growers are working and how producers are working if they're buying grapes, that what's the eventual outcome as a wine. So this is a kind of yearly cycle from the spring to autumn, and just to remind you how the wine works and when the weather conditions really are crucial, and also to remind you that it's not just that year's growth but also previous year's growth. So harvesting next autumn, the actual work for the wine has already started previous year at the flowering. So when we get into vintages, we probably all have some initial ideas about vintages if we've been following the wine world for some years. We might have critics that we follow whose word we trust on their ideas about the vintages, but it's very important to know which are the preferences of each critic, because if you follow just critic out of blue, you don't know what their preference is, and it might not be exactly what your preference is. So it would be very important to understand and follow the critic for a while to see if your opinions align with theirs. But also it is really based I think only the good assessment of a vintage can be done by tasting a lot and lots and lots. So, and knowing your preferences as well. Some critics might like big years and hot years, and you might like cool years and shyer years. So also knowing that. But now that we go through the 4 wines that we have, hopefully you'll come out of this webinar understanding that it's not just one side that you can look at. So even like the first vintage that we're going to discuss, 2018, even this vintage has been really dividing people and even growers within the same region of what the vintage is like. So also, just a brief mention before we go to the wines, you need to realize that some producers might actually have the resources to not produce certain vintages or blend the lesser good vintages into something else. So like, let's take like 2 classical examples from Bordeaux. First growth chateaus in Bordeaux tend to have first wine, second wine, and possibly third wine. And if certain year is not successful, they can blend the wines and promote to still produce second and third wine, but maybe not the first wine. And then on certain years, so for example, in 2014, Chateau Margaux produced a lot more of their third and fourth wine than their second and first, because it wasn't they didn't find that year so promising for them. So you can adjust that way when you have the resources. Then another classical example, Chateau d'Yquem, they didn't produce any 2012 because 2012 was a disastrous vintage for them. So they actually had the resources and the funds to leave out a year's production. Not many small producers have that option. And it's also got to do a lot with just sorting and selecting the berries. Some might be able to discard maybe even half the crop, some might not. So it really depends what you can do, and then how you deal with the fruit that you have in your hands. So let's go into the first wine after all this theory. So our first wine is from vintage 2018. Now 2018, as you see from the picture, it is regarded as a very, very hot and dry year. We're not going to cover the whole of 2018 and the whole of wine world, but we are going to talk about this particular wine that you have in your glass. And this is a Riesling from Rüdesheim, which is a village in Rheingau region in Germany. And this producer is Markus Lundén. So Markus Lundén's Rüdesheim Riesling 2018. Now, what was 2018 like in Rheingau? First of all, the year before was good. So during after harvest 2017 and throughout the winter before 2018, the water reserves in the soils were really, really replenished. Okay, it wasn't it wasn't the biggest rainfalls, but it was okay. It was kind of average, but it was good. And then the year started really well. The spring started very promising, but then already in April, it was almost like summer temperatures. This meant that the bud burst happened quite early and was quite fast. Overall, the year was early, so the bud burst happened on average 7 days before normal, then flowering later on 17 days before, then vegetation 21 days before, and then harvest 24 days before normal and normal timing. And this is not just Marcus, but in general in Rheingau. So Marcus's bud burst happened on the 19th of April in 2018. And because of that warm weather in April and the water-rich soils from the winter, there was a lot of green growth. So the vines really bursted into life that time. And then when we got into the summer, the summer was very hot and very dry, as indicated also in this picture, which is obviously not from Rheingau, as you probably figured out. So the summer temperatures were in average 3 degrees higher than normally. There was, in most of Rheingau, there was absolutely no rain between June and September, which was very hard, especially for the young vines, which in any case, every year normally need a bit of irrigation to get started. Also, the sloped vineyards, where the soil tends to be much more shallower than on the flatlands, those rocky soils really, really suffered. But even Marcus, for this wine, most of his vineyards are actually on the flatter lands where the soils tend to be a tiny bit deeper and have a bit more water. Even he had to irrigate. So pretty much everybody in 2018 in Rheingau had to irrigate to keep the grapes from dehydrating. There was also some sunburn in Rudesheim on some extremely steep slopes. So it's the only way to try to not have your grapes burned to death is to irrigate. And I remember, seeing this in many occasions, whether that's been in Napa in 2017 or harvest, or Bordeaux in 2018 summer. You really can see how the grapes are before harvest time, how they are becoming raisins already. So then harvest date. Harvest date obviously is very crucial on years like 2018. If you pick too early because you're worried about losing your acid and you're worried about too high sugar levels, then you might not have that physiological, phenological ripeness in the grapes, because phenological ripening might be delayed because of the drought. So in this 2018 year, some started harvesting already in August if they were producing sparkling wines in Rheingau, but then the best wines were obviously harvested in October. Marcus's harvest started on the 12th of September. So I was asking yesterday, speaking with Marcus, I was asking him yesterday, so how do you find the 2018? And he said, well, okay, first of all, it was kind of super easy vintage. So there was no disease pressure because it was hot and dry, and diseases like cool and humid conditions. So the grapes were healthy. They were fully healthy, hardly any disease pressure. Then also the yields were good. So when they first saw that it's going to be dry conditions, hot conditions, they saw the grapes were very, very small, and they thought, okay, there's going to be not a lot of juice, but just a lot of skin. But it was for some reason there was lots of juice. So when he was pressing the grapes, he needed to have much less pressure on the pressing cycle than in normal years, because it was just the free running juice was just really coming out super easy from the grapes. So the skin to juice ratio was much smaller than they expected, seeing the grapes were quite small. And this also helped with having good acidity in the wine, because when you add more pressure at pressing the grapes, you extract that you get more higher pH from the skins. So in years like 15, when the conditions have been somewhat similar, the pH was likely a bit higher overall because the pressure at pressing was much higher. 2018 was not quite as hot as 2003, and also 2003 it was kind of hot all around, whereas 2018 had all of those kind of peaks in the hot days. And Marcus thinks that obviously 2018 is going to be more for midterm than long-term aging, because usually cooler years tend to be aging perhaps a bit better because of the acid. He still thinks that the wine is interesting now because it's open and ready to go, but it still has enough freshness from the acid, even if the acid is a bit rounded than normally. In 18, there was also very, very little malic acid, so you didn't have any problem with trying to stop malolactic fermentation, because there was hardly any malic acid to be turned into lactic acid. So this one, if you want to know the numbers, this has 7.5 grams per liter residual sugar, exact the same amount of tartaric acid, and it's 12% alcohol. Now, there's been some people who think 15 had a lot less acid than 18. Marcus is not very technical, so he was just thinking from his back of his mind that perhaps 15 had a bit more, but he doesn't really analyze. He makes decisions based on the taste, so he didn't have the analysis in his head. But he really found this wine quite balanced and nice now. And I personally, I think it's super balanced. I think the acidity 7.5 grams per liter is pretty good for this, and I don't taste the warmth as much. I think the fruitiness is there. I think it's quite opulent, but also there are very little restaurants that nowadays can really age the wine. So this would be something that probably customers would appreciate as well from a young vintage, to be quite approachable already. So what I think about what we can learn from this wine and this vintage and this producer is that, you know, some people did pick too late and then they had no acid. But if you manage to do the right choices during harvest, if you didn't dehydrate your grapes during the summer, and if you are buying the wines for early drinking or midterm drinking, then I think 2018 Germany can be quite successful. Sure, there's been critique that there was a lot of diluted wine because of the high juice ratio on the berries, but I think in the hands of great winemakers, that's not going to be the case. Okay, so that's the first wine. If we get into the second wine, now we're going into 2014, and we are going to go to Italy, to Piedmont, and to Langhe area. So our second wine is Langhe Nebbiolo from Aurelio Settimo, from a vintage 2014, which was very cool, quite rainy, quite wet vintage overall in Piedmont. So the winter between 2013 and 2014 was very, very wet. And then the spring carried on pretty much the same way. Temperatures never reached very high, and it was wet throughout. However, the spring was quite early and the fruit set was quite quick. So it kind of set the promises to the producers that, okay, we're going to have a nice early harvest and generous yields. But then the cool and wet July really kind of destroyed everything, every dream. There were even lots of hailstorms. And as you might know, hailstorms tend to be very localized. So Barolo was hit quite hard. But also, as we see climate change happening, these rainfalls and storms will be much more localized in the future as well. And it's not really, the issue is not really how, you know, the total amount of the rain when it happens, but it's more about when it rains, it really, really rains. So the intensity of rain has become a big issue in many regions, and we'll be talking about that with the next wine as well. So anyway, Barbaresco was quite much more successful in 2014 than Barolo, but it was actually the Dolcetto areas that suffered much more than Nebbiolo, because after the summer, when the harvest approached, Nebbiolo, as you know, is picked much later than Dolcetto. So that the warmer September that 2014 saw really gave a bit more time for Nebbiolo to kind of heal from the cool and wet summer. It was a small crop here, so about approximately 25 to 30% of the normal yields. Then again, what is normal yield nowadays? But it also, because of these hailstorms and because of coolness, it has become a lighter year that's probably going to be only for midterm drinking. So this is now 2014, and I think this is now the time to drink this wine. I wouldn't buy it to my cellar anymore to store, as it's a Langhe Nebbiolo and not a Barolo. But there are producers who have been comparing 2014 to the Piedmontese vintages of 1970s, even such a classic vintage as 1971. Some have mentioned 1974 or even 1964 that 2014 has reminded them of. So for this wine, the grapes are sourced from exactly the same area as the winery uses for the Barolo, but it's only mentioned as Langhe because it doesn't see any oak aging, so it's only done in large cement concrete tanks. Also, the yields are same than for Barolo, but obviously the skin contact is much lower as well because there's no prolonged maturation. To me, the wine clearly shows quite elegant, quite cool type of tannins. Not much. There's not much kind of like density into the tannins. They're more crunchy. Also, the mid palate seems to be a bit more lighter in style, and I think there's balancing acidity, but I'm kind of lacking a further depth that would tell me that this wine could be aged longer. But also now we get to the point that, you know, classic Barolo years, for a comparison between like 2006 and 2007, some critics really praised the 7 because it was so warm, so ripe, really luscious. But then 2006 is more like a classic, fine, elegant year in Piedmont. So it really depends what kind of style are you looking in the wines. But what to learn from this wine is also know your producer and remember that weather events are becoming more and more localized. So even if you read about a vintage that it's been rainy, maybe it was raining in some parts of the area, but not in all parts of the area. And I think the comparison between what happened with Barbaresco and Barolo, for example, that year really goes to show that's important to remember. Okay, then we move on to 2016. And now we go to Spain. We go to the western side from Madrid. We get to the Sierra de Credos area. And this is vintage 2016, which in that area was relatively cool, or at least moderate, promising wines with finesse and elegance and longevity, and perhaps complexity that will only reveal itself with time. So this wine is Commander G, La Bruja de Rosas 2016. So 2016, it was a nice year. It was one of the best years that Sierra de Credos has seen. And later on, 2018 has been a super good year as well. But 2016 has really become praised in that region. And also not just because of the perfect condition during the year, but also for the quantities. There was quite a bit of wine, which is very good in that area where most vines are old and gnarly and don't produce that high yields anyway. So autumn 2015, already after harvest, it started to rain, and it rained throughout the winter, which really replenished the soils ready for 2016 springtime. The spring was a bit rainy too, and there were these storms that tend to now happen more and more. So when it rained, it really poured. And in some places, there was a bit of erosion problems, but not that much as you might imagine with stormy rainfalls. The flowering was a bit later than normally. So normally it flowers there early May, but this year was around the 20th for Commander G's vineyards, obviously depending also where their vineyards were at, because they have different parts planted. But then the summer was relatively moderate, not cold, but kind of cool, not too warm at all, especially if you compare it to the hotter vintages like 2015 and 2017. So the ripening was really kind of slow, and that's perfect because then the grapes have a lot of accumulation of interesting aromas and flavors. There was some rain during the summer, so which always brings a bit of mildew pressure. So they had to Commander G, they had to spray a bit of copper and sulfur every now and then. But then the slow ripening led on to kind of normal harvest time, and it was started on the second week of September, lasting all through until the end of October, depending on the plots. So old vines that they use in the area, old vines tend to be a bit more adapted to vintage conditions, but also old vines really struggle if there's a lot of water stress. So in warm years, like last year, 2019, which was ridiculously warm there and dry as well, even the old vines that normally would be quite adapted also suffered a bit. Now, we have this wine in 2016 and 2017 in our stock currently, and tasting the 2017 compared to this 2016, you can really see that the weather was not perfect. So there was summer hail, which already made decrease the quantities about 50%. There was also rain during flowering, and it was just disastrous frost also in the April, and in the highest parts of their vineyards, which can be up to 850, 900 meters above sea level. And then there was a really dry summer and autumn. So it's when you compare 2016 and 2017, for example, next to each other, you can really see the changes. But here we also get to the point that what do you buy your wines for? If you want to buy wines that will reveal much later, that have cellaring potential, then this 2016 from Bruja de Rosas is probably your go-to wine. Whereas 2017, if you want immediate pleasure, that's much more open now. It's also a bit more, maybe a bit more funky, if you want to say that. As well, there was some stability issues with some wineries. If you want to have like kind of easier to approach style of the wine, then 17 will be probably your go-to wine. But if I would buy into my cellar, I would definitely go for the 16, because then that's for the longer promise, later promise. So also here, what to learn is, again, know your producer. It's important to taste producers' wines every year to see how they differ from the previous year. And also, in the hands of skillful winemakers, even the not so good years can become closer to the perfect years. So, for example, at Commander G, they are very rigorous about their berry selection. Always. So 2017, they were leaving out much more berries than in 2016, when the ripening time and the harvest time and all year was pretty much perfect. Now, this wine to me tastes very, very dense. It tastes like this. It's not revealing everything that it has to reveal later on. Even this is the kind of village level style, meaning that it's more fruit forward than the single vineyard wines, as the grapes for these come from around the village, but not from just one certain particular plot. But even still, also knowing what 2017 tastes like, this really kind of holds back something that you want to get into and find out what it is later on. So it's not revealing its full potential just yet, to me. Now we get to the last wine, which is a 1996. 1996, and this is a vintage port from Douro in Portugal by a producer called Poças Junior. Now, 1996 was not widely declared as a vintage port year. So vintage port years tend to be the years when the weather conditions have been super optimal, and which in Douro means very, very hot, very sunny, creating really, really concentrated grapes and really making really big wines. So those are normally the ideal conditions for many port producers when they want to uniformly declare a vintage. And then these kind of lesser years, they tend to release single quinta port wines, but not vintage wines. Now, Poças Junior, they, in their team, between the head winemaker at the time and the general manager at the time, they were not sure what to do with 1996. But the vintage was thought, especially by the general manager, he thought that the vintage is probably an underdog, not showing everything yet, but perhaps later on. And he really pushed it through at the winery that they will declare the 96 as a vintage port and not release it, but to wait and see what the wine will be like in 20, 30 years time. So this wine was bottled in 98, but it's still being sold. So they still have stocks of 96. And it's really become the unique selling point now, because now they can compare this wine 96 vintage, which they only started to sell quite recently, to, for example, quite widely declared 97, which is a big and powerful port wine vintage. So now they have this ability to compare and to also sell older vintage, because they were one of the only ones who actually kept it, made it and kept it. So also going to the vintage conditions, the winter and the spring were quite wet and mild. And so there was a lot of vegetation again, as the wine likes to do that when there's a lot of nutrients and rain available. And then the harvest was quite late, but the sugars were lower than normally in declared vintages. There were some really outstanding single quintas produced that year and released that year. For example, Quinta de Noval Nacional was made that year. But it's how Poshas finds it, they're not really traditional. They're not really following these classical declarations, but they are doing their own things. And what comes to vintage port in general, I think it normally takes at least 20 to 30 years when the wines start to drink. Now, for example, if you have an 85, which was a really good vintage port year, those wines are really showing great now, being over 30 years old. But also you can taste in the wines that they have a long life ahead. So it depends again, what do you want to find in your vintage port? Do you have the patience to wait 30 to 40 years to drink them? Or do you prefer to have vintage ports from years when they start to show maybe in 20 years time and drink quite nicely and be quite fresh? So this wine, I find, is not too sweet at all. And it shows that freshness from that year. So they picked the grapes from one estate called Santa Barbara. It's actually, they still have that estate with the same name, but they just kept the name but changed the estate. So this estate where the grapes came from, or one of the estates used for this wine, it comes from south of Douro, but from the very, very high altitude, which also provided the freshness that year. So they really wanted to use those grapes to have a fresh wine from the fresh vintage. So obviously in 1990s, the harvest times were much more later than nowadays are. So normally, they started in mid-September, when nowadays they're already starting, in mid-August for whole production. So it's really shifted a lot. So underdog year, a bit lighter than you might expect from a classical like 97 vintage, but also you need to know your producer and follow others and trust. So you need to know your producer if they follow the others, or if they are underdogs, and you need to find out and be know about the USPs and appreciate the potential to try these kind of wines now. Now, I'm not a big port drinker. I've had the chance to try a lot of 50 and 60-year-old ports, and sure, they're great, but it's not something that I could just take a full bottle of port and drink it on my own. I could never do that. But here I find the freshness and the elegance and the lightness quite pleasurable. It's not as overpowering as many port wines can be. So I'm seeing that the vintage is definitely much fresher, but I also appreciate the fact that now I can drink vintage port at this age, buy it even now, and get something that's as old as 96. So that was the tasting. And here are all the wines that you have. So from the left to right, Marcus Lunden's Rudesheim Riesling 2018, Aurelio Setimo's Langhe Nebbiolo 2014, Commander G's La Bruja de Rosas 2016, and Poshas Junior Vintage Port 1996.